His murder shocked the nation. The horrific image of a child beaten at the hands of his murderers, distorted beyond recognition. The child who barely turned 14 years old, accused of whistling at a white woman, was another victim of the hate that permeated white society in the Mississippi Delta. Many of the civil rights activists who were part of the civil rights movement called themselves the Emmett Till generation. They knew it could happen to them, and so they struck back at the injustices they saw all around them to make sure it never happened again. This is Loki Mulholland, and it's time to get uncomfortable. Well, today we're joined by my co-host, freedom writer, Luvon Brown. Luvon, how you doing?
All right, Loki, how are you?
Oh, doing pretty good. So this is actually our first video one, because where all of us are on. Because when we did Ron Stallworth, your video wasn't working, but we had him. And so now we've got you, and we've got Devery Anderson joining us.
Glad to be here.
We truly appreciate it. So Devery is the author of Emmett Till, the murder that shocked the world and propelled the civil rights movement, which is really the quintessential. I always tell people it's the Bible of Emmett Till, but it's the quintessential work about Emmett Till. So Devery, just real quick, just give us a little background about your book and the work you did on that.
Well, the book, I wanted to write the book that I always wanted to read on Emmett Till. And I always wanted to read a book that told the whole story in excruciating detail, because I felt those details are often lost in various tellings of the story, and that they were important, that they added not just real life drama to the story, but just important detail that you needed to fully understand what happened then, why the interest remained, why there was this resurgence of interest in the early 2000s, and what led to the investigation that happened in 2004 to 2006. And so I just thought all of that was just very important to know. And so I spent 10 years researching and writing the book by going to Mississippi and Chicago several times. I interviewed everybody who would talk to me. That included witnesses such as Emmett Till's cousins who were there at the store incident, as well as a kidnapping. Willie Reed, who was the one witness who heard the beating in the shed and saw Emmett Till on the back of the truck. He was one who was able to place the location of the murder. And I interviewed journalists who covered the trial, who were still living and lucid enough to talk, and other participants at the trial, or witnesses, spectators at the trial, just anybody. I tried to get a hold of Carolyn Bryant. I tried to talk to family members of Milam and Bryant. Got a few people to talk to me. They were hesitant, so I couldn't quote them, use their name in the book, but I used them as confidential sources, so I was able to get more information than I thought I was going to be able to. So I tried to be thorough. I did a lot of archival research, and after that 10 years of researching and writing, produced this book that was published in 2015 upon the 60th anniversary of the murder.
Wow. And we're coming up on the anniversary of that murder, as a matter of fact, with August 28th, today being August 14th. But the title on your book is that propelled the civil rights movement. Not that the civil rights movement weren't necessarily already taking place. There's always been a movement, but to propel it, and where many people just John Lewis, for example, has said that that he called himself the Emmett Till generation. Luvon, you were what, 11 years old when
I was 11 years old.
Yeah.
And it's funny that listening to you talk, I don't think I've ever read a book other than Jet Magazine and Life Magazine about Emmett Till. And I think that's because, I don't know why that is. The facts of the case, I thought I knew. In other words, he's not the first person to be killed by Southern whites, and certainly not the last. It's just that what his mother did made the case more, I guess, home to us. Because I was 11 And all of the parents that I knew that I can remember were did not want their boys out late at night because white people in that, and certainly in Mississippi, when they, I don't know, tasted, smelled blood in the water, you didn't know what was going to happen. And the anger that they had was what they believed to be true was that Emmett Till had said something to this white woman, um, as if that was the important thing to them, that he said something. And what was important to the parents around me was that we be off the street and away because white people would, there was bloodlust. Um, and so from then on, I was associated Emmett Till with one of us is going to die. That had nothing to do with it. And the other problem, the other thing is that I think a lot of us, I guess what happened to him was horrible, but it didn't surprise a lot of us. It was, I mean, there are bodies all over the place now, even now, but certainly then, that things used to happen. Nothing with the sheriff, the FBI, nobody would do anything. So I don't think that the murder itself was what got us all upset and wanted to do stuff later on. I think it was the fact that it was done with impunity, that the federal government took an interest in it, but they have to work with the local people. And we didn't, at that time, think of anything happening. All we thought about was, we have to be safe. I think that was, so his mother showing the body and all of that, we knew about it, but, and we thought that was horrible. Certainly I was 11 years old, but not unique. It's just that this was the one that got caught.
The fact that Emmett was 14 years old, did that make it unique in that respect? Because typically it was adults that was getting killed.
I suppose. It certainly made us, the parents, more careful about their children, and it certainly made us more careful about being out late at night. But I never thought about it in that respect because I'm 11 years old. All I thought about was being safe. And as I grew, and Emmett Till comes up often, and I think correctly. But back then, all we thought about was that we don't want to die, and we don't want to be the next one that they kill. It was interesting that none of us ever believed that Emmett Till said a word to her. Even then, we didn't believe it, because in the South, you knew to stay away from white people by that age. You knew. And certainly where he was up in the Delta, you knew that you didn't say anything to these people. Now, maybe he didn't, maybe he did, but we never believed that. It was, to us, it was just another murder of a black kid. And kids did get killed. And kids did disappear. So it was not, when a white person looked at Emmett Till, he saw an adult. When he looked at me, that's what he saw. So, and he knew that nothing was going to happen to them if they attacked. We felt that anyway. I think that the reason it gave rise to the movement was the way it was handled by the mother. That she wanted us all to see what had been done to her kid. And she made it a kid, as opposed to another black kid. It was a black person. It was a kid that they did all of this to. And they made up the story so they could do that. But people had been lynched, murdered. That wasn't the unique part. It was what the mother did.
So Devery, Levon brings up a particular point of that they didn't even think that he said anything to her. And that's always been kind of the central controversy. It doesn't justify it, of course, but did he grab her? Obviously there's this, salacious, what she says on the stand, not necessarily in front of the jury, but that's in the trial transcripts is, practically, sexual assault. But so did he say anything, or was it just really the wolf whistle when she came out the door?
Well, and you're correct, certainly, that it was important to the defense to create this scenario of him being, and she even referred to him in her testimony as a Negro man. I think that was definitely something her attorneys told her to say, to refer to him as a man, because there was nothing that would have triggered an all-white jury to come back with an acquittal more quickly than any sexual impropriety between a black man and a white woman. And they would consider anything sexual impropriety, whether it was just a look, a smile, anything. And so by referring to him as a man, they had to just bury this fact that he was a child. And so that was that was very important to that. But as far as whether he said anything or to her, I mean, just what his cousin said is that, his cousin Wheeler and Simeon, and also Maurice Wright, all said that when he came, he was in the store by himself for a little bit, not very long. So, don't really know what happened then. There's her version of that, which we know she was, lying to some degree, if not the whole thing. But his cousin said that when he left the store, he smiled and waved and said, "Bye," kind of funny. He didn't say, "Bye, ma'am." That upset her, and that as she walked towards the car, he whistled at her. And that scared them all, and they got in the car. Wheeler Parker said that on the way back to the ride home, Emmett said, "Oh, please don't tell Uncle Mose." And but he was from the North, and so he wouldn't have really known. I mean, his personality was such that he was just kind of a fun-loving kind that liked to show off. His cousins have said that a lot. And so he wouldn't have known, even though his mother told him how to act in the South, for a 14-year-old that wasn't raised having that idea ingrained in him from birth on, in the moment of being around his friends and stuff, he would have, like any 14-year-old, wouldn't have thought much about that and thought, "Oh, this is going to be fine." Especially if others were kind of egging him on, which is what, and not egging him on. There's different versions of that as well. But Wheeler just said that, he told a few reporters that some older boy there, he didn't identify who he was, said, "Hey, that they were talking about girls, obviously, that sets the context." And some older boy there said, "Oh, there's a pretty girl in the store, you ought to go in and talk to her." That's something Wheeler Parker told Jet Magazine and a few other, the black press as well as the northern white press, like the Chicago Tribune and the Sun-Times and that. So we kind of get an idea that he did talk, but it wasn't anything that anybody would ever think was, unless you were in the South, would ever think was salacious or a flirtation, really, even anything serious.
But even the fact that they would say girl, there were some interpretations that he might not have even known, because she's, Carolyn Bryant was so petite, that he might have mistaken her for, a young teenager.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would have, I don't think he had any idea. I don't think anybody said, "Oh, there's a married woman in there, go flirt with her," or anything like that. And she was just 21. So I think he just saw her as a teenage girl, and being from the North, a teenage boy talking to a teenage girl,
yeah,
and not even flirting with her or saying anything inappropriate wouldn't have even seemed like bad to him.
Yeah.
Do you think that did you find anywhere that she was? I always got the feeling that she was caught, or her boyfriend or husband, or suspected that she had done something with him, either smiled or came on to him or whatever, and being caught at it, she started making up lies.
The only time I've heard anything like that was, I think it was a woman, I think she just died recently, Peggy Morgan, who said that her father had claimed to have had like an affair with Carolyn Bryant, and that she was known to be with other men, but I'm not sure how, I don't know, you know, and so I think some people have maybe drawn from that maybe she was flirting with Emmett or something like that. But I don't know of any sources that really are credible. I mean, that's certainly, you know, a possibility if the evidence is there. But I just haven't heard it from any source that I you know, could really count on or use or anything like that.
So the story of Emmett Till is that most people are familiar with, comes from Look magazine.
Right.
And this William Bradford Huey, who paid for the stories themselves. I mean, there's all these sort of massive conflicts of interest to begin with, but then he rewrites the entire narrative because he can't get the actual testimonies from, you know, the release forms from other people who are actually involved in the murder. So because it wasn't just these two guys, J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant.
Right.
And so the story that most people hear is what? How does that usually transpire? What's the classic thing that you always hear from people?
Well, you just hear that J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant, the two that were tried for the murder, were the only two that were involved, that they picked up Emmett Till, kidnapped him, took him to Milam's home, in the back of his home, and beat him in a shed there, and then took him to the river, shot him, and then threw him in the river. And that during that whole time, Emmett was not afraid, stood up to them, talked back to them, and that angered them. And so their version is they acted alone. Emmett was being what's the word?
Uppity.
Uppity.
I guess, yeah, uppity, and not staying in his place, and that gave them a justification. So them telling that, any white Southerner who would have read that story would have felt they were justified in killing him, or at least most would have. I mean, that was why they were defended by so many people prior to the trial, why the money jars were put in the stores, because people weren't so much concerned that they were going to trial and were innocent. They were concerned that they would go to trial and be convicted, and that would be the beginning, the domino effect on the Southern way of life. Right. That convict them. And there are enough letters written to the defense by concerned citizens from the North and South saying, if you convict those men, then we'll start seeing blacks and whites dating here or in the South, just like we see in the North, and then segregation will end and you'll become another Chicago. So that was their concern. It wasn't these guys were innocent.
It was the Southern way of life.
It would just
the white Southern way of life.
To them, it was worth the cost of having a child murdered and the men get away with it, then lose their way of life. And that's not an exaggeration. That's what the people were saying.
Well, and this is, so a little historical context, Levon, you can help fill in some of this particularly, is you have Brown versus Board in 1954, and then you have Judge Brady with Black Monday, and these stump speeches and things that he's giving, in essence a stump speech, but where it turns into a book. And this book, Black Monday, really riles up the South, in particular Mississippi. And here you have this about miscegenation, and that the North is going to take over. They're going to end our Southern way of life. So this anger is really, really brought to the forefront. Not that wasn't always there, but in particular, in leading up to this summer, white Southerners seem to be on a tear.
I'm trying to remember if this was before or it came later that the Northern politicians gave in to the Southern politicians so that they would get their votes. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm trying to remember. The Southerners were what they always were, and the Northerners that agreed with them were what they always were. But at some point, they decided to leave the South alone because the South carried X number of votes. And they didn't want to come right out and say they, meaning the Northern politicians, didn't want to come out and say that they believed in racism and miscegenation and all that, but they did come out with states' rights. The North started the whole idea of states' rights, and the Southerners took up on that and said that means we can do what we want to do. And the Northern politicians said, well, that's right. You run your own business and we'll run ours. And there were a few people in the North who said, well, that's wrong, but that's not what happened in the political system. So I was trying to remember when that deal was struck. That's what Johnson meant when he said, I just lost the South, when he signed the Civil Rights Act. Mm-hmm. And that was what he meant, was that the deal that they had made with the Southern Democrats was over.
Right.
So I don't remember.
But as a kid, do you remember the atmosphere in regards of 54, 55? Yeah.
The heat went up.
Right.
And everybody felt that we were next.
Yeah.
You know, it was a cross between, well, that's in the Delta and they do stuff in the Delta, because we're all incidentally afraid of the Delta. Jackson, I was in Jackson, and it was supposedly a little more sane than the Delta. But the bottom line is that it was pretty much all the same. Everybody knew their place. So I remember the heat going up after Emmett Till was killed, particularly with young men. Girls not so much, but the young men. And I remember, interesting, I remember all of us trying to stay out of the way of white women, especially. Not say anything to them, not be around them, not be alone with them. I do remember that. And because I guess if nothing was done with Emmett Till getting killed, imagine what would happen if it was just an ordinary killing. That, nothing was done to people. And I think that was all that I remember, is just that fear of you being in the house before when it was dark, that you didn't go out, that you didn't, well, there was nothing to do anyway, but that you didn't go out in the yard, you didn't go hang out, you didn't do anything if you were a male, because they blamed everybody for what Emmett Till had done. Mm-hmm. And they had to prove that that's the way Black men were. So a lot of people ended up disappearing, but we just remember fear.
And there's this element, Devery, that prior to the NAACP and Emmett's mother, Mamie Till, going to the press, that Milam and Bryant were not pillars of society.
Right.
But suddenly, once the South felt that they were, particularly, Mississippi felt that they were attacked, everyone started galvanizing around them.
Right. It didn't take very long either. That first few days after the murder, when you read the letters to the editors in papers and editorials by newspaper editors, they were saying these men have been arrested and justice needs to be swift, and whoever killed this young man, this little boy, need to pay the price. But yeah, and right away the South or Mississippi, they were already under so much scrutiny as it was in the aftermath of the Brown decision, with segregation and that was the big talk in the gubernatorial campaign. But the race was decided the day before Emmett Till went into the Bryant store, so that had been in the air, with each candidate trying to out segregate the other and promising to be the bigger segregationist. So everybody was worked up over segregation as it was. And so once they felt outsiders attacking Mississippi, then everything changed in an instant. They went from being sympathetic to Emmett Till, being on his side, wanting his killers to be brought to justice, to then raising money for their defense and becoming very defensive. Nothing upset them more than outside agitators and any outside press commenting on their way of life. They wanted to be left alone, and that bothered them so much. And again, they saw the slippery slope. That's what kind of created that whole idea of, if you convict these men, then we're going to lose our way of life. So yeah, and you really see it. It's not something that historians have had to look back all these years later and say, yeah, the tide turned. It was obvious to people right then. People were writing in the papers almost immediately how the tide had turned against Emmett Till in an instant over that criticism.
Yeah, but there were people, in particular TRM Howard, who understood that this narrative that was going to be told, that what was going to happen in court, clearly wasn't going to be to the benefit of African Americans. And so he started doing investigations as well, and a lot of this reporting ended up in the Chicago Defender and such as well, right?
Yeah, Pittsburgh Courier, I think, is where a lot of his stuff, his investigation, his interview with him about his investigation was published there. So yeah, and he was seen, people didn't like him in Mississippi either, because he was everything they thought a black person should not be. Well-educated, financially stable, in a better financial position than most whites, and was outspoken for civil rights. So he had everything going against him from the white person's perspective in the South. They wanted him dead, and he was a marked man. He had to move to Chicago because in the aftermath of the Till case, and I think it was in March of '56 that he moved to Chicago and left the South because, he was in danger.
So I kind of see some parallels here taking place in regards to Emmett Till, that suddenly when it's not going to look good for whites, that we're going to change the narrative.